Hi, I'm Mike Baker and welcome to National Arts. On this program, we'll take a mystical journey with the Parisian equestrian troops in Garo. But first, Thomas Wilmer Dewing was one of the most important artists in the turn-of-the-century Gilded Age. He's best known for his wistful depictions of beautiful women in dreamlike settings. It stands to reason, therefore, that the quintessential exhibition of his work by the National Museum of American Art would be titled Beauty Reconfigured. Susan, this is the first retrospective of the work of Thomas Wilmer Dewing.
And it certainly is, since his death in 1938. There were several tiny shows that you could call retrospectives that took place in his own lifetime, but it's taken this long for us to really gather together the finest phases of his work and really evaluate him again as one of the finest turn-of-the-century painters who's been too long neglected.
When people try to say that an artist is reconfigured, they approach it from three different ways. The old abiding concern of what the figure or what the subject is. The whole notion that they are trying to create a certain subjective look at beauty. And then the third notion of the technique, or always trying to involve that. Would number one be his most important concern here?
Well, you know, his great apologist, Royal Curtisis, who wrote for the Tribune, always said that Dewing's greatest need was to express beauty. But I'll tell you, as you look at these paintings, there's a lot more going on in them than beauty. And when we talk about reconfiguring the sense of beauty, it wasn't a tranquil, undemanding elegance that we're talking about. Every painting has a quality of tension in it. His most successful works have a sense of energy. The two-figure paintings have actual splits within them, psychological splits, splits of composition, that I think reflect the subtle undercurrents that were dissonant in his own life. He led a double life, like his friend Stanford White. All was not what it appeared to be. And so these are not just works that are easy to see, easy to take. You can on one level, but on another level, they reflect the dissonance that was certainly part of Victorian America.
There's almost a dream world there.
A dream world in which sometimes there was a bit of a bad dream.
Yet he was a favorite painter of many of the turn-of-the-century patrons of the time, wasn't he?
He was very well known and internationally well known too. From the time that his lovely Lady in Yellow, which is here from the Gardner Museum, won the silver medal at the 1889 Universal Exposition, he had an international reputation. But always really in the long run, was most favored by a rather small core of devoted collectors. So.
He's most known, obviously, for his portrayals of elegant women in rather sparsely populated rooms or landscapes.
The female figure was his primary vehicle throughout his lifetime. It always puzzles me. People wonder why Dewing always painted the woman. But in fact, all of the turn-of-the-century painters of this particular type, the group known as the 10, focused on the female figure, often in interiors, but sometimes in landscapes. And it was seen as the most beautiful kind of subject to paint. You could pose her in lovely gowns, give her figure psychological meaning, or perhaps abstract meaning, form and shape. To paint men meant you'd involve yourself with issues of business, perhaps things that were a little more gritty.
All the trappings.
Less escapist, and art was seen as a way to disassociate yourself with some of the unsettling phases of the new American economy and industry that were emerging at the time.
Was he ever at war between perhaps technique and image, or were they always married in his mind?
I would have to say that for Thomas Dewing, the subject really never was subsumed by technique. His works are always identifiable. The theme of whether it is a monochromatic theme, a study in gold. For example, I'm looking over at the lovely painting Lady in Gold from the Brooklyn Museum. It's almost a monochromatic study in shades of gray and gold, different permutations of the same tone. You never lose your consciousness of who she is, but the abstract qualities unite him and show him looking forward to concerns that would be taking over artists' thought for the next 20 and 30 years.
In looking at all of Dewing's work, there's one word that comes to mind: harmony. There's always harmony between the subject and the background. They're never at war or at odds with one another.
Well, that's because he was a tonalist par excellence. Are you familiar with the word tonalism?
Mm-hmm.
It was, again, a turn-of-the-century mode of painting that really started with Whistler, where you have very close color values. You don't go too far to the lights and too far to the darks. I'm looking behind you at a wall of 3 paintings that are quintessentially tonalist. And while if you look closely at, say, the middle painting, which is Pandora, there are reds and greens, ostensibly. They are attenuated to such a degree of delicacy and paleness that they turn into a silvery hue as you step back, even though they are complements. The colors are brought so closely together that they turn into a tone, a unified tone. And that wall of paintings is a classic statement of Whistlerian tonalism.
Susan and the Spinet, subject and background almost entirely marry here.
They do indeed. There's a very sensual quality. In fact, one critic writes that there's a sensuous note in this painting more obvious than in any other painting by Dewing, and that's the gleam of her rounded shoulders. And I also like to add that the shoulders that undulate go up and down like music on a scale. And she is playing a piano. It's called the Spinet, but it actually was an early square piano. And artists at this time were very interested in the marriage not only of texture and subject, but of sight and sound. So you have the idea of music elevating the soul and the marriage, as I said before, of oral and visual elements. And you certainly have that in this painting right next door to it, which is called Brocart de Venise. And certainly this painting brings this to an apogee of the figure listening to the woman behind her who plays the piano. But it's also a very psychological essay, too, in that you have the figure in the foreground, somewhat like Vermeer, totally ignoring other figures in the same room. And we think that Dewing was inspired by Vermeer's use of space to set up psychological tension between figures. And while they're very different, it's a very different kind of usage than Vermeer, there's still that sense of distancing that you have in both the 19th century and the 17th century painter.
Outside light.
Yes, and we always talk about Dewing and Vermeer. This is the only example where Dewing actually used exterior light in one of his paintings. The others are all rather hermetically sealed interior spaces. But it's reflected light. We don't actually see the window.
Mm-hmm. Do you think he saw light as obtrusive and maybe a means of interfering with a certain artificiality or beauty that he wished to create?
I think that's a fair assumption. I think daylight tends to really wake you up and show all of the flaws and all of the actuality of existence. And he's taking us into another world. And so daylight tends to be jarring. But what I'd like to point out here is how you don't actually see any hard lines. If you follow her arm, for example, you can't find the edge. It's a lost and found line. And I like to remind people when we look at this painting, he was a very fine draftsman. He was very capable of drawing a hard edge in his academic works, you can see. But as his work progressed, and it was typical not only of Dewing, but many artists, they were not interested in a hard edge, but in impalpable qualities of shimmer and changing atmosphere, of that sense that nothing could be actually touched and felt, that it was impalpable is a good word, I think. And so you can see that you can't really find an edge here. It comes and it goes, it comes and disappears again.
I get the impression we might be in Cornish, New Hampshire. Is that true?
We certainly are. We were talking about the Spinet, which shows this correlation between sight and sound, and also Brocart de Venise. But you really have a true synesthetic painting here with sight and sound being the subject. We have 2 women who are listening to something you can't see. It's hidden up in the tree, and it's a little bird called the hermit thrush, which is the title of the painting. It was the favorite bird of New Englanders, and it had a very distinctive warble, which Dewing echoes in this huge pine tree that stretches across the landscape. And so in a visual sense, he's letting you hear the bird. And then in another sense, too, the women become bird-like with their little winged arms as they stand in hip-high grass, listening to the bird. And some scholars have even gone so far as to say that nature becomes an all-pervading feminine other in the Dewing paintings of the Cornish period.
Susan, I get the feeling here that one of the figures is transfixed up, the other down, and a direct contrast, obviously, in where the thought processes are.
That's true, and it does correlate to the interiors where you have opposing mentalities, and here they are too. And I like to think this picture is perhaps the most personal of all of his Cornish works, because in some levels it's decorative, on another level it could relate to a photograph of the time which shows his mistress Annie Lazarus on one side seated on an exedra and his wife Maria on the other. I'm not saying there's a one-to-one correlation, but it could refer to the excitement of illicit love and perhaps the tranquility of longevity, marital longevity that's not as exciting. Or we can see it as perhaps the stress, the strain of the artistic life versus the everyday life that most of us live, which is humdrum and everyday, which is comfortable but not as exciting. So one can look at this picture as one that really had a personal meaning for the artist. These early works really stress the quality of fabric. It's a very Rococo, by that I mean 18th century style of painting he would have admired, say, in the works of Watteau and then later Corot, where you see the young woman perhaps reading a billet doux from a lover, the romantic quality, the Louis XVI chair, but great emphasis on the beautiful definition of pink tulle. And then, of course, he's very free in the background, so we see harbingers of things to come there, where free brushstrokes then take over, and we don't see so much careful definition in his later works. Well, the piano is the centerpiece of the Dewing exhibition. We weren't sure we would have it in the show at the first, but it's proved to be the organizing fulcrum of the entire exhibition. Because not only is it a great draw, the public loves to see this beautiful instrument, but it also reminds us that these paintings were painted for domestic interiors. The shields of the 13 colonies were painted by Maria Oakey Dewing, Thomas Dewing's wife, while he himself painted the lid. And in keeping with that revolutionary theme, that patriotic theme, the 9 muses are dressed in what we'd call today colonial revival gowns, meaning the 19th century's version of what a colonial gown would look like. Until recently, we were fortunate enough to have it conserved at the Conservation Analytical Laboratory, and it's all been newly gilded, and the painting has been restored to its original glory.
Isn't it unfortunate that he had almost lapsed into obscurity when he died?
Well, you know, we all think we want to live to a ripe old age, but your age can be a little too ripe. In his case, he lived maybe 30 or 40 years beyond his popularity, and he lived long enough to see modern art overwhelm the turn-of-the-century themes and subject matter and style that he had been involved with.